Dini Jini pandani tipang okrato tangi baca tai pandano songsamani kokno to saimano belekano jeng ang hambai maro Aitorma ni bising tui jeng piltam Maharaja Bikram Memorial noti koklam salai tong ojarawo daya sasujak ang bumung kuliah jini okra sakra rokno kuluma yapari tai hauso joto tongnai borong genang juk bebakno no ani kuluma tai hamjak maci bai yapari kok kaisa thaini chawan tini ni salo jeng jini Tripurahani laibomani paithak bugra notui se jeng abono moitukhlai tabukni omolo jeng paithak bugrani kokno no moitukhlaio oboni se sigang jini asuk bugra butang satong mani kokrok nole jeng moitukhlailia tini ang ojarawo wansukro jini paithak ni bugrani kok bijabo sijak tongo bini simi bijabo sijak tongo okogya jeng Tripurahani rasmala no tumung jodi porikhai baksa borokrok 184 jona bugra jalangkha neibo jeng siri khoklai tong jini thanio rasmala no tei podre pod bane rajani songkha no tei kok salai tongo pheba jeng khorok busu rasmala bijat no tei share khogui porioi tongkha abono kaham ke phili porioi tongkha abosi tini Maharaja Bikram to sini paithak ni bugrasi obni bagai ang obosi tini ni salo khulum jawo bugra Maharaja Bikram ni se sikang sini bugra rok phan ganang de tong na phan kuri borok Tripurahano sajon khaine krungde krungya jeng obono bo pansuk khaitong tumung jeng sini kokya phangno sakangai kai jini osai rokni khugo simise ha asai kothma sane rokni khugo simise saimanchiu jeng hangnaini jeng dongoi I hangnai be dongoi sabo am meaning suru se jini borok rok jeng khorok sabo saimangya tabu khorchasuk okrano romoi singkhangkai tamo abo bobo sabai sukrubai sanani renglia tamni bage hingkai Tripurahao je Tripura kok thai tongmani Tripura kok thayo asuk sakok kara kok kaham tongmani abono no jeng sekmai khibika jefuru jini Tripurani Maharaj dharma maniko ni bupa dharma maniko rasmalano Tripura kok ni Sanskrit tai Bangla bai jengkha a jorano dulu sontai kaisa kapmani tong obo hai sumsok otor gerei tamni hingke dulu sontai sau Tripurani kok hai kethar Tripura kok hai kubui abo hai gerei tumung okokno bunyi thani bunyi buskanggo ani kothma kokno sana nangma susa sumsok otor obri bagai belai wana masingsa aboni teruk kaino dharma maniko ni simino sini Tripurahani hukumu wo tabuk sini sesekang sini ain bedek ni kereng kok kenaroi tangka boto Maharaja Bikram ni ya gulo sini birman nangmani kokno sesabo sini bai phaimani abono tumung wansukui na kangkai teibo sekang no sung bai mani kok odo phari laibuma kok thangno sana thangtani wo Sukresor banesor sontai ni ha asai kothma kokno sapruwo 어버하이 사만이 동고 어도파 벨라이노 그타 우선다이고 거사 그타 뭐 라이브만 꼭는 심이 사이면이야 디낭니 꼭는 뭐 사이만오 bus 거 따모 응나이 아보노 사이만오 전다이 둘로 전다이 벨라이 캐나 깝슬 깝카 어버하이게 깝카 다이 비니 아제 디브라 하제 숨소 어떠로 낭나이 흠마니 아보 아곡 나이가 탕리가 아곡 따복 낭파야 정 마하라스 비크롬니 꼭는 심이 완축 디브라 하니 꼭만이 비신거 정 무승판이 꼭는 승사이만이야 기승만이 꼭는 승사이만이야 생통만이 꼭는 승 따복 완축 라이고 거룩니 거룩담 아보보 우스강니 심이 생니 생만 제 생통마 리사딱네 버레이 리사딱나니 그릉 심이야 아자고 쪼박하냐니 그릉 뜨둥나니 그릉 억사나니 그릉 르삽나니 그릉 생통만이 꼭네 깨보 사이만라리야 깨보 아보네 필의 승살라냐니 보 완축라이 따복 생통만이 비잡니 꼭너 비니 비잡어 따모 시작 꼭동 한가이 이 하용 하고더러 바 인디아니 히스토리와 tumungjudi sakai janchirani ko boto saba khle taimani ko ya piaba tibrahani beri ni kok sakai kai bunyi dopani laibu mako bororo banjang tibrahani beri rok obo hai tangui tibrahawa beri rok asasa judi sengtuma simi do saba kereng khana ba tumung bini society wo bini hukum wo beriro jadi coba ni praktis kaya hakai bulai nani solai nani badukung kok nani abo bini asai drobono bo seringnya hakai hataka rani engo hani da bo coba klaiman hataka da bodo hani kok nawan cukma actually jini ang berirok ni engo berirok ni pasingan om awan cukano jini census ni pacigo tabuk baria ang kaini kai tham point ni kok no sabana tabuk school visit to thangai na kai kaisa school kotor jaga aro 1 to 5 ba jini student 35 20 25 15 obo ni meaning tam khai jini serairo asai mani common tha obani bisingo se chini sarai rokno tamonu drugs addicted no chini sarai rokno tamnu belai speed ke chalu goi accident to thijak no chini sarai rokno tamnu tei phok gobang ma kiri ma singja bufang hakrai bothai hai chini dofani korok ro buri ro gobang ma chini komor ni thai abani bagai o zorawo chung okra zerai babak no utuk wan chukna ni jora o jora ka hamno sana ni ano jora rekha Aitorma ni bising tui ang Aitorma ni phasingo gobang mano mas sereng manmani tongo tai belekhena hambai maro sini father bijeno tai kok borok no tui tipra kok no develop khanya ni bagi sini benihin Aitorma ni bising tui sarben father benihin je samung khlailang mani bonobuti ni ang belekena khasi sing ma tongo mutu ma khlayo obni bagai jasapano obo ngi tongra thung tamkhai tirpura ni lai buma tumung judi seri phekyan kai agi bosung jon songke gobang mani ko ya chini lai buma ni ko thamawo ya ayang ha dihong ni simi chontai ro ko sai tongo kasolong jora chachiko je saga kumila abo chini jomindari chakha rusunabad tai busuk jaga kotor ma tong heke jaga jeng borok kisisa kotoi ungphano chini bukhani thuyo chini thuyo thik thar tong tamni bage hingai tibrahani je rasmalani kok moto kok se thuyo thik thar ni saja ore bage chini sung je oro asai tongnai tibrahani thuyo mi asai tongnai chini thuyo thik thar tong chini thuyo thik thang tong chini thuyo thik kubul tong chini phalano wanchuk ni kai chini khago ok thai kubuk tong chini thuyo khaka thar wanchuk mani kok tong abo sung tum kisisa naikhlai wanchuk naikhlai norok sakno sini manai tabu sung chini sakno sini nani फासिगोन आं नरक जतननो जों जतननो जों आबनो वानसुक्लाय होननानै कबगै आंनि कक अरनम थाखा जतनन हामबाय
बेले के हामबाय बरम गोनां जुगनो नांगौमानि I invite Shri R.K. Noatia to deliver his speech.
Jotana Kulunga. Good afternoon, everyone. Ini Maharaja Bikram Memorial Lecture-3. Dr. Bikram Tripura, Assistant Professor, Tata Institute of Social Science, Mumbai ni Mosini Dayasa Tongo, Mona Hambayaparo, Chief Guest, DM Zomatia Shahib Tongani, or Mini Kokna Vitaka, Monoba Hambayaparo, Botobo Dayasa Turi. Dayasa Tongani, Father P.J. Joseph, Director Don Bosco Peace Center, Monoba Hambayaparo, Father Tabok Dayasa Turi. Wo bini samne boi thangpaika diocese tongnai Dr. Bikram Tripura, Mr. Thomas Molsom, Madam Prishati Deborma, sini oholo asukjak manganan Dr. Bijoy Deborma, Advocate Horidon Deborma Aroze Manganang Jotono and Hambayapuro. Tini E platform Anikok Sananiko Gia Ano Koksa di Honai request Kaimani, Ani Koksanani Manushika Goritini, and Kanani Bagupayo. Tini platform of Dr. Bikram Tripura, Assistant Professor, Tata Institute of Social Science, Mumbai ni Oro Faikeji Onustan, Oro some main Bini Kok Nanai, and Oro Jotana Kobogo, Bini Kok Payaso, Yonustan Payas Joto, Sitting Sinclair, Bini Kok Nanai Bagay, among Bini Mulaban, Kok Oboknagay, so next step, Sini Nijani Zapino, Bahaka Agokmanai, Nijani Rajono Bahake, Protect Kaimanai. Sini serai robno next generation ada pucuk jago bahai ketlang mai, abno, so wang sungai bini kok khanai, kok sabina kok mataka jatona khulumka.
Tini ni je lecture koklam, nangkumani koklam, koklam ni tabu nui rem, jangan ni naik tunggu, apa ni sekarang ang borong nak koi naik.
On behalf of the organizers, it gives me immense pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Viswaranjan Tripura. Sir, we are honored by your presence and we look forward to your valuable insights. Sir, I kindly request you to deliver your speech.
Okay, hi, good afternoon everyone. It's already 1:30, so 1:30 looks like it's a lunch time. So I'll try and see if, sometimes it's very difficult for an academic to inspire an audience like this when the community leaders speak like that, Of course, I also belong to the community, but we're a scholar that have been working for almost more than a decade on the Prasa and tribal studies, so I hope I don't bore you with a lot of, I will try and see that I don't put a lot of jargons to kind of put forward my ideas from an academic perspective. So since I'm an academic, I'm a scholar, so whatever I put forward my perspective will be from an academic perspective. So, Jotano Kulunka, greetings. It's not Punkaham anymore, it's Dipakaham. Okay, so before I kind of sort of speak about deliver a lecture what I'm supposed to, so it's important that I acknowledge the land and the people of this place. So before I deliver the Maharaja Bikram Memorial Lecture-3, I would like to pay my deepest respect to the indigenous custodian of this land, past and present. I wish to acknowledge that we are gathered here on the ancestral land of the indigenous peoples of Tripura, whose histories, struggles and wisdom continue to shape our collective life. As an indigenous person myself, I recognize this as both as a site of knowledge and belonging. And this is from this place that I speak today. I was very emotional and touched when I heard the first song in the morning. That's what tells us where we belong. So standing on this indigenous land, I honor the generation before us who nurtured and protected it. My words today are offered in continuity with this struggle and aspirations. I speak here today before you, not just as a researcher, but as someone who belongs to this land and the Mother Earth. I honor our ancestors, whose wisdom still guides us, and I hope my words will carry forward their own spirit. Further, before I begin, I'm grateful to Reverend Father Joseph Pauline Thanut, who is lovingly called as Father PJ, other members of organizing committee of Aitorma, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share some of my scholarly reflections on revisiting indigenous people's question in Tripura towards inclusive policy as part of Maharaja Bikram Lecture-3. So, in this particular lecture, I have divided my reflection into 4 sections. First, I will speak on about the context and the people, and I will also, some of you who are sitting here and listening to me is probably already like the speaker whom we heard from Honorable D.M. Zomatia, happens to be one of them who is actually the part of the history of this land. Like similar like this, there are a lot of people here sitting, is same as like that, is part of the history that most of it that I'm going to talk about, and you might have heard of it, but it's just that I'm going to put forward some thoughts from a scholarly perspective. So the second thought that I'm going to say is about the category of tribe, Borok, indigenous people, and the concept Tripura that came into being, and it became part of the struggles of the prasa of this land. And the third section, what I'm going to talk about is 3 historically concrete conditions of the questions of the prasa in Tripura. What I would call it as the question of land alienation and restoration, and the question of governance, and the question of language and the politics of script. Then further, since the question is also about towards inclusive policy, I'll give forward some of my reflection on how can we see, for a policy implication from the history after we revisit. So I hope that I can deliver this, as short as possible. So the indigenous tribal question in Tripura arose from the destructive and near inconceivable changes that took place in their demographic realities. From this context of struggles in the 1960s, there emerged various tribal political organizations which took up the mantle of voicing indigenous people's concern, and through which the radical act of rehistoricizing their existence were undertaken, that is to revisit, to reformulate, and to resurrect. This declaration manifests in indigenous people's organic need to revive their history, reconstitute their identity, state historical claims of a land, make visible their system of governance, stem their physical and symbolic presence in socio-political space, and above all, renew their demands for some degree of representation in a new state system that suddenly treated them as people without history. So, attempting to revisit this very complex reality, this talk takes a dialogical historical approach in examining indigenous tribals question in Tripura. So, this is the latest book of mine, which is titled as Everyday State and Development in Northeast India, which is published with Rockless. Partly what I'm going to speak today is more or less from the chapter 3, which is of this particular book, which is titled as Dialogical Historical Approach to Indigenous People's Questions in Tripura. So, in the oral history that is told among the communities of tribes of Tripura, it is believed that Donguima, Dongipa, everybody knows, were the ancestors that started their civilizations. So even today, the tribes of Tripura relate their historical existence to Donguima, Dongipa and consider it sacred. It is worth mentioning here, the poem written by one of the young poet whose name is Dayal Tripura, who wrote in remembrance of his history and existence in his own mother tongue, and it refers to Donguima, Dongipa. He writes, Lai bumano rutugui malaika, Donguima, Dongipani busuk bataini hapen. Tabugbo kamalangyakho hakara besero. Holongo bumung tagza bok himani lamaro. So in English, it could be translated as, I witness, in search of my origin stories I witness, citing the remains of Zoom cultivation by many generations of Donguima, Dongifa. Stories of our ancestors are still alive in the presence of sacred forests. Their names are also carved on the rock and the roads that they took to the forest. So in believing in the Donguima, Dongifa civilization refers that the indigenous tribes of Tripura is a non-caste society, unlike the caste society in the mainstream India. So as per the historical records, Tripura is believed to have existed as a princely state before its accession to join the Union of India. The Manika ruler was one of the oldest royal families in the eastern India. So in the late 18th centuries, Tripura came under the British colonial rule and enjoyed a special status among the native states. After the partition of Indian subcontinent in 1947, the princely state acceded to the Union of India and became a Part C state in October 1949, and later it became a Union territory on 1st November 1956 and a full statehood on 21st January 1972. So this everybody knows. So in the period post-independence, so the ratio between the tribe and the non-tribe population underwent a rapid changes. So if you look at the statistic, in the year 1941 to 51, before Tripura joined the Union of India, the percentage of decadal ratio between tribe and non-tribe was just 24.56%. But subsequently, 1951 to 61, an abnormal high decadal variation of growth rate that took place up to even 78.71% that was registered. So these rapid demographic changes became a wax issue within the state at the time and is still today. Therefore, like our Honorable D.M. Zomati also has said, that Tripura is the only state in India where the indigenous communities have been outnumbered by a massive influx and therefore reduced to minority status. Therefore, even scholars like H.M. Burre even pointed out that such demographic changes are an extremely rare event anywhere in the world, and sometimes that has no comparable precedent even in the world history. So now let me bring to you some of the category on what I would call it as from tribe to Borok or indigenous people or the word Tripura, how all of these have shaped the political history of Tripura. So during the British regime, the category tribe, like any of the other places in the country, in Indian subcontinent, was referred to all the hill people. Tribe was referred as to all the hill peoples of Tripura. You could read interesting book by Captain Lewin, which was published in 1869. And post 1949, after its merger with the Indian Union, hill peoples were categorized as scheduled tribe through the Indian Constitution of Article 342. So similar to the term tribe, so the word Upajati was initially propagated by the hill people of Tripura themselves as part of the Tripura Upajati Yuva Samiti, which means Tripura Tribal Youth Organization, which originated in 1967. The use of this term in a self-named tribal political organization could be argued as indicating the community's acceptance of this politico-administrative category as being distinct and having the capacity to represent their needs within a specific time and the space. So at a later period, after 1980s, the Tripura tribal area Aitorma district council was recognized under the categories of tribal or scheduled tribe. We have 10 sixth schedule in the northeast India. Tripura is the only sixth schedule in the country that is based not on single particular tribe, which is based on 19 particular tribes, as an overarching identity of all hill peoples of Tripura. However, this acceptance of the usage of the word tribe was rejected by many of the newly formed regional political party by late 1990s, who began utilizing the local word called Borok. Now let me come back to the word Borok. As an ascriptive nomenclature, which I would call it as a post-tribal identity, in 1990s. So Borok began to be used here and seen as an opposition to the word Upozati. As an example, there was a demand even by indigenous tribal groups to rename the autonomous council as the Borok Areas Territorial Council in the 1990s. However, the non-tribal community in Tripura, who now constitute the majority ethnic group in the state, continue to refer to indigenous hill people as Upozati, Pahari or tribal. So, in such a context, Borok became an identity construct which formulate indigenous people's struggles to reclaim their rights over land, territory and their culture. So history records this contestation over categories as leading to a division along the line called Borok and Upozati identity construct. So in the period 1970s, assertion of the identity based upon such categories coupled with struggles for state recognition in the 1970s under the rubric of scheduled tribes brought further degrees of complexity to an already highly conflict-laden situation. So rather than as a divisive category, some members are here as member of Kokborok Saitya Sabha, conceive Borok, which connects tribes with their shared historical experiences and community identity, symbolizing social structure and their worldview as people belonging to one ethnic group. So in such conception, Borok here became as a symbol of identity articulation and assertion to the indigenous people of Tripura. So therefore the construct Borok became a distinct identity marker that indicated differences to other communities in the state. So in addition to this category called Borok, tribe, Upozati, the term like indigenous people started to be used by the hill peoples of Tripura to refer to themselves around the late 1990s. So being directly influenced by the predominant political-historical process defining indigenous people's politics in the 1990s, there's a creation of a new regional political party, that is the Indigenous People Front of Tripura as a unification of Tripura Hills People's Party and Tripura Tribal National Conference on 9 June 1997. This kick-started local politics based upon the concept of indigenous people. So, drawing on this momentum, intellectuals within the community began also to refer along these lines of indigenous identity in order to establish a shared history along shared cultural roots. Therefore, civil society organizations which emerged around this time began to articulate along indigenous line. A case in point being the Borok People's Human Rights Organization. So likewise, in the current context, so the category Tripura found increasing resonance within the identity debate after IPFT demanded a separate state within the jurisdiction of current TTDC in 2009, which they claim was necessary following the continuing concrete conditions for Tripura people. So, with the emergence of Bubagra as part of the movement against the Citizenship Amendment Bill in 2009, further gave rise to the acceptance of the category Tripura people. So, therefore, if we would look at all of this category, tribe, Borok, Upozati, Pahari, indigenous people, and now as Tripura. So, in current everyday usage, the category Tripura now represents, in my understanding, as the new common self-identity of the indigenous peoples of Tripura, which I would refer it as. So now coming back to my the third section that I'm going to talk about, that is the three historically concrete conditions, which I would refer it as the first one as the land alienation and the restoration. So as our former speaker also have spoken, that land alienation is one of the primary causes of the tribal unrest in Tripura following acceding to the Union of India. So many scholars argue that land alienation in Tripura mainly took place due to the influx of immigrants from erstwhile East Pakistan, which is present Bangladesh, beginning in 1947. So before the 1970s, most initiatives undertaken by authorities underscored the alienation of tribal population from the land they had traditionally cultivated. So later, the state government of Tripura de-reserved an additional 300 square miles of Tripura reserve land out of the total of 2,060 square miles. So during the same period, the Tripura Land Revenue and Land Reforms Act came into effect in 1960s in order to restrict the continuing transfer of tribal land to the non-tribal owners. So as the former speaker also has spoken, as per the section 187 of the Act, the transfer of land by a person who is a member of scheduled tribe to a person who is not a member of any tribe is invalid without the previous permission of the collector in writing, as per as per 187 of the Land Reforms Act. So however, the Act did not provide any provision for the restoration of illegally transferred land. And to that end, it was amended in 1974. So as per the amended Act, if a transfer of land belonging to a scheduled tribe is made on or after the 1st of January 1969 in contravention to the provisions of subsection 1, any revenue officers appointed for the purpose of the state government may provide an opportunity for the transferee to be heard and by an order in writing exact the transferee and restore the transfer land, which is Second Amendment Act in 1974. So as of 31st August 1987, the total number of petitions to restored land received by the subdivisional officer and collector was 19,089 petitions, out of which only 3,633 petitions resulted in land being physically restored. So I have looked at another study done by Simre, who looks at the official records of tribal land restoration in Tripura to the period until 2001, in which he says that a total of 28,999 cases were filed, out of which 8,636 cases were found in favor of restoring illegally transferred land. Further, I have looked at the report by the Government of India 2004 as well, which a report by the Scheduled Areas and Scheduled Tribes Commission quotes that a number of cases registered under the Tripura Land Revenue and Land Reforms Act 1960 as being approximately 27,000 cases, out of which only 6,757.03 acres of land could be physically restored. Let me quote what does the commission report says. I quote, the report recommends that the Tripura Land Revenue and Land Reforms Act 1960 should be further modified and the date of the restoration of land from tribal to non-tribal made effectively retrospective from 26/1/1950, the date on which the Constitution of India was adopted. So the Government of India should set up a special tribunal for this purpose, borrowing magistrate from states other than Tripura and West Bengal, unquote. So the amendment to the Tripura Land Revenue Land Reform 1960 is being criticized for setting 1968 as the only cut-off year, a date which many indigenous people say has no rational or logical explanation. There was no explanation provided by the state lawmakers as to why 1968 was considered the cut-off year for illegal transfer of tribal land. Professor Khaksang Deborma interprets the act as effectively condoning the illegal transfer of tribal land which took place even before January 1969. So many indigenous tribal people also argue that if the act was genuine in its effort at land restoring, setting 1960 as the cut-off year would have made more sense. This is because most of the land transfer began in earnest only after 1960 with a massive influx and settlement of refugees from East Bengal. So in the context of land alienation, it is also important. I come from Gomati district, erstwhile South Tripura. It is also important to note here that the commissioning of the Gomati Hydel project in Gomati district in 1976 also displaced thousands of indigenous communities from their land. Official record shows that 2,558 tribal families were disposed, while unofficial record estimate that between 8,000 to 10,000 families, or about 60,000 to 70,000 individuals were displaced due to the project. However, only those individuals who could produce land records were rehabilitated, and many who did not have official land deeds. So the system of maintaining a land deed against an individual name is a recent phenomenon in Tripura, as previously the use and ownership of community land were governed by the customary practices. So therefore one could argue that it is therefore unethical for the state to demand land deeds as a prerequisite for rehabilitating displaced families. So now let me go back to the second section of the historically concrete condition, which is the governance and the autonomy. So therefore the challenge to the state being posed by the indigenous tribal communities with their demands for tribal autonomy, and so the government of India create Tripura Tribal Area Autonomous District Council in 1979 by an Act of Parliament as part of the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution. These did not appease the indigenous communities of Tripura, however, continued their protest to have it included in the 6th schedule. So therefore the Indian government eventually brought the TTADC under 6th schedule in April 1985. The first election was held in June and a new council was enshrined on July 1985. So as you all know that the TTADC is premised on a generic and a composite entity, a council for tribal areas, not on a single tribe. However, the gap between its initially conceived function and its current function is widened. The role and impact of the council in terms of its greater goal of political empowerment of the indigenous people has been a matter of debate. So criticism on the TTADC ranges from lack of financial autonomy, the 3 council seats being reserved for non-tribal members contradict the spirit of self-governance. Many retired officers and administrators means that the council is also lazy and slow to implement decisions. Regular village councils are irregular, and that adds to inefficiency. The council also has yet to codify customary law and an over-dependence on the state government, which I've also written this in an article which I've done a project previously in 2018. So further criticism centered around the structural efficiency of the TTDC, that is the village committee established under Tripura Tribal Area Autonomous District Council of 1994. Struggles to fulfill its role and there's no clear defined the role of administration in Tripura, it is being seen there is a dual form of administration. One administration which is done by the ADC and another administration which is by the state. So therefore the role and the function of the zonal or sub-zonal office was hardly visibilized or have become obsolete. It is difficult now to differentiate between the administration in ADC areas and the non-ADC areas. The village committee, which all of you know, is practically subservient, means subservient to other administrative bodies as it would be in a non-ADC areas. For instance, the sub-zonal office and the members of the village committee are located within the block development office. This arrangement arises mainly due to the lack of available funds and ultimately therefore the neglect of the state to provide sufficient fund as outlined in the 6th schedule article 244(2). So it is important to note that some of you, if you know, that Tripura is not exempted under article 243M, like Meghalaya and Mizoram and other places where the conception of the local governance is no different with the non-tribal area. So if 243M of the constitution would have been applied in the case of Tripura, and so the customary law and the governance system would have been effective. So legally, the customary law of the people governance system does not legitimize to be effective. So as a reaction to their dissatisfaction with the present operation of TDDC, the indigenous community demanded that the central government allocate more power and directly fund the TDDC. So therefore, even the unexpected signing of the Tiprasa Accord 2004 show that there is a will and effort on the side of the government of India and the government of Tripura to intervene and find an amicable solution to this question posed by the indigenous tribal questions in Tripura. So now let me go back to my third section under the concrete conditions, which I call it as the language and the script politics. So some of you are already part of this movement as well on the language. So let me now, to try and address the indigenous tribal questions concerning over the politics of Kokborok script, the state government responded by constituting members of commissions and committees to evaluate the argument around and the development of the Kokborok language and recommend the policy changes. There are mainly two important government reports with respect to the Kokborok language setup under the leadership of Samasaran Tripura and Pavitra Sarkar. So the first script selection committee, known as the Samasaran Commission, was constituted in 1991. So ultimately, Samasaran Commission recommended the following, which I read: the Roman Commission to be adopted for the Kokborok language, the medium of instruction to be Kokborok from the pre-primary states and extended to Madhyamik states, Kokborok speaking students also to be taught Bengali from 3rd grade onwards. For schools in non-Kokborok speaking areas, Kokborok should be available as an optional subject for grades 6 to 8. Kokborok academics should be established for the development of Kokborok. Recommendation regarding the alphabet of Kokborok script, confirming Kokborok pronunciation, and the rules proposed for Kokborok spellings are appended in this particular report in Appendix 1 of the report. Despite the recommendation made by the Commission, not much of work has happened. So a second Kokborok Language Commission, again constituted in 2004. This commission was popularly known as the Tripura Opposati Basa Commission and operated under the leadership of Pavitra Sarkar. It recommended that Kokborok script to be used in the writing of Kokborok language as opposed to Kokborok script. Their recommendation also entails the inclusion of Kokborok in the school curriculum up to class 12 for both tribal students and non-tribal students. It also proposed the use of Kokborok in official communication and to establish rewards for achievement in Kokborok literature. So I have read through the report. It also says that an entire section of the commission report is actually dedicated to a comprehensive analysis of the language history, which probably some of you also might have been interviewed by him, especially on the analysis of the language history, its development and its status. So it also delved into the politics of the Kokborok script. I have happened to write my first book on the educational experiences of indigenous people, which to some extent I have been able to put some of these ideas. It also delved into the politics of the Kokborok script and includes views from Kokborok speakers, Kokborok writers, students, educators and intellectuals, which is published in the Government of Tripura 2004 report, page 30 to 38. So despite broad state government involvement in this report on the future development of Kokborok language and specifically resolving the issue of script selection, the succeeding state government did not implement the recommendation made by different commission, but rather legitimate Bengali script as a chosen script for writing Kokborok. So therefore it is high time that the Kokborok of Tripura that the government of Tripura respectfully listens to the voices of the indigenous tribal people of Tripura as to decide which script they wish to write their own mother tongue instead of imposing the script of the dominant community. So today, the indigenous tribal communities in Tripura continue their campaign for the Kokborok language to be recognized under the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution, along with the specific question of the script selection. Other important concerns also include, such as what kind of curriculum is to be included in schools, especially schools located in tribal area, whose history, culture, identity, ideology, and knowledge such a curriculum depicts or represents. How can the school curriculum be respectful and inclusive to all cultures and epistemologies, which means the knowledge? How can a school curriculum become inclusive so that students belonging to both tribal and non-tribal communities do not feel that they are alienated or burdened by their identity? So now let me go to my last section, what I would towards inclusive policy. After having visited the histories and the struggles of the people, how can we, what could we learn for a inclusive policy implication? So here I divide into two sections. One is on the socio-political life and the socio-cultural life. So in socio-political life, I would perceive that it is important to revisit the idea of a more autonomy, which is being discussed now, a process to be guided with the principle of mutual dialogue, respect, and pluriversal. So what we call it as the respect for many knowledge, or respect for epistemologies in the philosophy of methodology, if we call it. Maintaining the ideals of respect for diversity as enshrined in the Indian Constitution. Second, I would say that the inclusion of those tribal villages excluded by wrongful historical decisions within the present territories of TTDC should be included. Thirdly, the alienated tribal ancestral land to be amicably restored to their original owners in line with the customary practices. Fourth, ensuring that the present tribal governance system should be empowering and effective from within by reflecting on the relevance of Article 243M with respect to Tripura Tribal Area Autonomous District Council, like as what we see in Meghalaya and other 6 scheduled areas. So the current scheduled tribe reservation in Tripura should be revisited. This can be a concern as it relates to a possible delimitation in the near future. So constitutional protection amendment should be allocated, especially when it relates to the indigenous tribal peoples of Tripura, by considering the demographical history and the complexity of the region, which has resulted in a certain political vulnerability. And the 6th CAA IC should be exempted or repealed from Tripura state, as this only adds to the existing demographic complexity and conflict. Coexisting together with respect and diversity means opposing any forms of universalization or singularization based on under one civilization. So it is important also to legislate to increase the representation of tribal women in the state legislative assembly, district council, village committee, and other important institutional policies or positions. It is important as well that the tribal scholars must be involved as part of the state policy, especially when it concerns to tribal issues in Tripura. So my next section is on the socio-cultural life. What is important to do as for a policy? The Kokborok language must be recognized within the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution, as has been a long-standing demand by the indigenous tribal communities of Tripura. the present politics of which script is officially used must be sorted out by allowing the indigenous tribal people themselves to decide without imposing or prioritizing certain ideologies or dominant cultural hegemonies. So, however, if Kokborok is recognized under the 8th schedule, it should not be made compulsory or mandatory for other indigenous tribal communities or non-tribal whose mother tongue is not Kokborok. Therefore, the diversity of language within indigenous tribal and non-tribal communities should be given the highest recognition. The identity, history, culture, folktale, and the tribal history must be integrated as part of the school curriculum, while also including the histories of mainstream India, Northeast India, and the world history as well. So, special care must be taken to preserve the monuments, heritage, archives, sacred forests, areas, and original native names. A lot of names have been changed. Original native names of places with respect to tribal people and their history. So now let me conclude. Yes, I'm supposed to take 1 hour, because I thought a lot of people have spoken, so I should finish in 30 or 45 minutes. So I have exactly done that. So now let me conclude that for the indigenous communities of Tripura, their subjective experiences of marginalization gave rise to the strategies of assertion and struggles. So therefore the need to formulate their given struggles, making the usage of the category tribe, Upajati, Borok, indigenous people or now Tripura during various politico-historical phases gave rise to different forms of epistemic effort. Gave rise to different efforts by the indigenous communities. So moreover, their identity struggles emerged from rapidly changing structural dynamics with direct impact on their demographic reality, a fundamental part of mass alienation in the historically inhabited land. So from this perspective, issues such as ethnicity and ethnic mobilization are a last-ditch fight for survival rather than an exclusivist assertion against the other. Yet, assertions of ethnicity are indeed complex, as they imply an increased sense of social, cultural, political, demographic, also the economic marginalization. Nonetheless, land, governance, language, and culture, which I have already spoken, are a foundational elements of this assertion. So, therefore, within such an understanding, it is important to note that indigenous people's question in Tripura should not always be conceived as needless primordial activities. I see that it is an organic urge to be able to feel at ease with one's cultural space, which includes a harmoniousness and symmetry of worldviews and one's own lived experiences. Therefore, the reality of land, governance, language, and autonomy is a social necessity in the experiences of indigenous community, which is fundamental in any society for an empowering engagement. Therefore, the reflection on the coexistence between communities is to be ensured through a mutual dialogue and a respect by decolonizing any forms of dominance. So efforts to decolonize political dominance historically that I have spoken must be not only the responsibility by a tribal, it is also should be the responsibility of both the non-tribal and the tribal communities in building solidarity and a desire to live as equals, peoples capable to respect diversity, people of respecting many civilizations, but not one civilization which is based on. So therefore, as part of the decolonizing project, which means respecting everyone, with respect to the current concrete conditions of the indigenous peoples of Tripura, I assume that the state must also pursue constitutional protection in order to ensure the survival of indigenous people. To this effect, I strongly say that sharing, listening, and dialogue are imperative in the attempts to resolve any historical cleavages. So thank you so much. Thank you for patiently hearing me. Jotono hambai.
Ang haino hai desa hambai maya pharo chini surini khorang Subhendu Dev Burma Shukla Sadhan Jamatia Swarna Kamal Jewelry media partner.
We also thank our sponsors CJ Resort, Puito Engineering, Subhendu Dev Burma, Swarna Kamal Jewelers, Shukla Sadhan Jamatia and Shurini Kanmo. We thank you so much for your sponsorship to this seminar.
Bini nangkuk mani kok nai mani bagi bini kok nar mani ya gulo jeng joto nakija break nanai o pandani
Kapsa Salen mani ulo Cina Katonai Kebang ma Okasakra rok Cini Kerong Kerung rok Scholars rok Jotono Atsukja Afrono Jeng Layan Zamani ulo no Cina open discussions.
Now, I would like to request our response speaker, Sir Thomas Molsom, to kindly deliver his valuable speech on the dais.
So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to respond to the insightful lecture, delivered just we heard from Dr. Viswaranjan Tripura. So, I'm very much grateful to Father P.J. Joseph for inviting me to be part of this third Aitorma Maharaja Bikram Memorial Lecture. And it's also very much privilege for me to share the dais with many distinguished personalities and a community leader such as Madam Piyushati Dev Burma, Sir D.M. Jamatia, who, for some urgent work he left, and Sir Dr. Narottam Dev Burma. And to be honest, while I'm quite familiar with the remarkable contributions of Dr. Viswaranjan, but I'm not really certain if I'm the right person or the most fitted person to offer this response. Because after sitting and listening among such an intellectual mind of a person like Viswaranjan sir, I feel more like a student, which is I am a student, than a person to respond to what he delivered. But I accept this responsibility with the utmost humility and sincerity, and perhaps a bit of courage, which I will try my best to do the justice, the task which is given to me. So what I will share today will be the less of the critique and more of a reflection, one that I hope resonates with many of you, and it may be able to spark some meaningful dialogue and perhaps inspire us, all of us, to carry forward this event and in this room to fill with a lot of questions and interactions. And by the end of it, if you think that I was able to manage the task which was given, I think my task is accomplished. So, before beginning, what I understand, when you talk about the indigenous communities, indigenous tribal communities across the world, it continues to face multiple layers of exploitations, be it through displacement, loss of land, cultural erasure, or the economic marginalization. And in the world, there are 476 million indigenous people, which is they're spread across the 90 countries. And overall, percentage-wise, we are just 6.2% of the global population. Yet, within this global picture or the global existence of the different tribal communities or the indigenous communities, only few of indigenous communities carry a very great or a unique attention, or the kind of the exploitation level that they have faced is very unique. And these are the uniqueness of these communities receive or it deserve a great attention. And in this category, the indigenous people of Tripura fall, but unfortunately, our struggles have remained largely ignored, both in terms of maybe policy practices or maybe in an academician or in academic mainstream discourses. So, like I said, that I'm very much familiar with the work of the Viswaranjan sir. From Africa to Latin America to South Asian to Indian, there are many scholarship, there are many activism is taking place. Scholars like, if you read Linda Smith, Sylvia Rivera, Sabela Raman, all these things have done the work, extensive work, and they are still, carrying forward. And in this, you can say, to extend their work, our resources work, the published work, it extends the discussions. So I will suggest all of you to go through this book, because what he spoke to you, it's just a small bit of, if you see the book, you will see the entire history of the struggle, how indigenous communities of Tripura is facing. And I'm sure many of you many of you will be very much, in agreement with me that his lectures, it offers a rich and a layered history account of the indigenous community struggle in Tripura, which is grounded in a, dialogical and historical approach. This word for many of you may not be very much familiar, but if you read, or if you try to make yourself very much familiar with the kind of the policy futures or the policy responses that he suggested, this approach will be very much, you will be able to understand. His framing, or what he delivered, it moves beyond statistic narratives to victimhood, to highlight the dynamic processes through which indigenous communities in Tripura have asserted their identities, resisted dispositions, and demanded recognition. What reminded me listening to him and also reading his book, the book called Custard Died for Your Sin, an Indian manifesto by Vinnie Deloria Jr. If you read this book, you will be able to relate that yes, this is what we also face in a small state like Tripura. Because what makes Biswasa's lecture is just not, which is very powerful, and it is just not the historical detail that he have told us, but the way the indigenous experiences which is an ongoing and a living realities, and still we hope for the societies that, which will be very much inclusive. When we say inclusive, it's just not that we want some kind of, okay, we have given you an ST or the scheduled caste category, what else do you need? No, that is not what we want, right? So, when you talk about this, when he discusses on historical reframing and identities, one of the most significant contributions what I find in his lecture is that how it situates identity as evolving construct shaped by the historical raptures, which is like the transition that we face even in our identity politics, that from the tribe to Borok to then to indigenous people, and now recently to a Tipra or the Tiprasa, which reflect not only political necessity but also an epistemic strategies to self-definition or the self-determination, or you can see the struggle of the self-determination. And the reference to Dongoima and Dongaifa is more than just a story of tribals of Tripura's origin. It is a reminder that indigenous histories is alive in landscape, forest, in our collective memories. This means the Dongoima and Dongaifa as a cultural anchor shows that identity politics is not simply reactive, but also rooted in deeply held cosmologies and collective memory. So what this particular section makes us ask is that how do we ensure that such ancestral wisdom continues to guide us, because we already have come across to different generations, and how this is the same history or ancestral wisdom we must take it forward, right? Which is why we call it like passing down generations to generations, rather than just forgotten in the rush of modern development or modernities, which is what most of the time the state-led interventions claim for the tribals. And the lecture that he delivered, it also underscores when he mentioned about the land alienation, which is a central axis or the central point of the indigenous marginalization in Tripura. From princely states revenues-driven agriculture, which is from the cultivation of hook to the settled farming, and the post-independent, which is from a refugees influx to demographic shift and the loss of land to the state development projects like a Gumati Hydro project that unsettle indigenous ways of life and the tribal indigenous disposition, which emerges as a systematic violence rather than just an accidental. So the detailed recounting of the Tripura Land Revenue and Land Reform Act, which is also highlighted by our first speaker, right, Sir D.M. Jamatia, which it fails to reveal how legal framework often codify this position under the guise of or under the face of just protection and development. So again, this raises a question in present context that how can development respect the relationship that indigenous people hold with their land? And when he speaks about the 6 scheduled areas, we know that the 6th schedule, it is a promise, but we have to ask question, is it just to, in the name of giving autonomy, or is it just to cheese, or it's just to stop the resistance that is coming from the indigenous communities? So this is also one of the questions that very much, what I could relate. And if we were to reflect upon, what does meaningful autonomy will look like in a society where multiple communities must live together? Because if you see in Tripura, again, unlike many other northeastern states, we live different communities, isn't it? So we also have to acknowledge the kind of the multiple tribal communities that we live. And because when you talk about this whole historical disposition, the struggle, exploitation, I don't think any of the tribal will say that, no, we tribal, we communities, we have not faced an exploitation. Because in the Tripura case, all the tribals have faced a similar kind of have gone through the similar historical struggle. And when you speak about this epistemic injustice and how can you relate with the language politics, I think I'm very much in agreement with Biswaranjan sir, because the voices that we speak, it's just not the speak. It is a lived realities, which we speak from our kitchen to our bedroom to the market. But we have to ask question. This is the question that where do we speak now? Is it just rooted to our household? Can I speak in the market? Can I speak in my school? Can I speak when I go to other places? So this is one of the things that, I was thinking that we have to question. So to decide the future of our language and to bring in the kind of the epistemic justice that Sir Bikram talks about, we have to really talk about, the kind of the issue, the kind of the script politics that we face in a small state like Tripura today. Now, I won't take much more. Just the last reflection I want to give is when you say pluriversality or pluriverse. When we say it talks about a world in the language of Escobar, it is a world with many worlds. That means it values diverse ways of living, being, and knowing. So help me reflect, how do we balance the state-led development, modern development, with the preservation of our indigenous heritage, identity, languages, and what kind of the role should institutions play in safeguarding the culture and the linguistic right? And can history or our history be retold in a way that include indigenous perspectives, worldviews, rather than erasing them? Thank you so much.